I talked about genre creation in my previous entry in this series, and how so many DOS games you know and love are actually directly responsible for the creation of the genre they operate in. I also talked about how, in a desperate attempt to stand out from a crowd, more and more modern games have jammed genres together. I call this genre blending, but most of the more recent attempts at doing so have been absolutely ham-fisted, so perhaps that's the wrong word for it now. Dune 2 helped create the RTS, but it was its predecessor, released slightly before it, that really showcases what genre blending is. The first Dune is essentially 2 games in one. You have to master both if you want a satisfactory conclusion. The opening presents you with a narrative-based adventure game with recruitable NPCs and conversations. It doesn't have the conversation trees or point-and-click inventory-based puzzles of other adventure games of the time. The story is told more straight than that, and is about exploring the world and the people of Arrakis, and how you react to the events that unfold. The second part of the game is the overworld, a real-time strategy of sorts that has you managing and moving troops of Fremen across the deserts to obtain and protect land, defeat your foes, and amass spice shipments in order to send to the Emperor. Both of these elements run seamlessly in real time in-game, complementing each other. There's still very little like it to this date. The danger in doing this is that you could end up with something like Sid Meier did when he designed Covert Action. He tried to copy his Pirates formula by having several distinct gameplay modes, spread over 2 objectives: breaking into buildings to acquire clues, and solving the mystery regarding the criminal or terrorist activities. This led to the Covert Action rule of game design, where you should focus on doing a handful of gaming elements well, rather than doing a load of gameplay elements that detract from each other by being less than stellar. Other games around that time period would attempt this, like Kellen Beck's work on Defender of the Crown and Centurion, Defender of Rome, integrating a turn-based tactical overworld with multiple real-time engagements. The most memorable instance of this for me was when I first played Dungeon Keeper and obtained the Possession spell, allowing me to enter a creature's brain in the first-person perspective and wander about my dungeon killing invaders in an FPS. It was mind-blowing that Bullfrog had decided to include this, and it was optional for the most part too. They solely did it because they could, and it was fun. As the defined genres began to settle, so did the inclusion of those elements and their degree. It almost became an unspoken ritual for sprawling RPGs to sport some card-based minigame that 90% of its player base ignored, whether it was Bazak, Caravan, Acromage or Gwent. And the larger open-world games degraded this genre blending even further into isolated minigames like hacking or lockpicking to break up the tedium. The difference between modern games that attempt to blend genres and the games of yesteryear is that the newer ones do it with a sense of awareness. They're largely cordoned off from the rest of the game, with attempts to prod the player in their direction, resulting in the feeling of being an unnecessary distraction. Like the pointless planet scanning in the Mass Effect series that was cribbed from Starflight, a game that seamlessly integrated that system because they were building it from the ground up as just part of the game, rather than a mandatory mini-game that detracted from the experience. When Binary Systems were designing Starflight in the mid-80s, it was to create something memorable and interesting. When BioWare were designing Mass Effect, Starflight was already a thing, as was the Star Control series, and they attempted to mush together the RPG systems from their CRPG series Baldur's Gate with the space navigation of a completely different game, and it didn't work very well and felt like a cheap homage or afterthought in all iterations of Mass Effect, padding out the game by separating the merged narrative role-playing and third-person combat elements with additional combat scanning and traversal that just wasn't anywhere near as engaging. When Wing Commander blended cutscenes and crew interaction with space combat, it made sense. Of course Christopher Blair was going to have downtime and mission briefings and camaraderie with his wingmen, and it was nice to see the curtain removed and a sense of consequence and stakes added. It was nice to see the universe fleshed out through the eyes of the pilot, rather than from some still images and flavor text to provide motivation. It also meant when you docked, you were always wondering at the end of the mission what the repercussions would be, how senior personnel would respond to your latest actions or mission. This is how good genre blending works. It plays to the strengths of both mediums and merges them seamlessly, so the player doesn't feel impeded by sections of the game. And the best games allow the player to have a choice in the matter too. The original Star Control blends a top-down real-time space dogfighting engine with a turn-based overview. If the player didn't like one of those elements, they could let the AI handle it instead. In Rome Total War, the spiritual successor to Centurion, if you didn't want to fight the battles, you could auto-resolve them. Or if you enjoyed the RTS combat engine but didn't enjoy the military simulation, then you could enable arcade mode. If the turn-based strategy was annoying, and you just wanted to march troops across the map, you could automate all the cities you conquered. With all the genres now fleshed out, modern developers actually run a risk when trying to create something that blends multiple genres together. Because even if they get it right and all the modes the game offers are polished and coherent, players might only enjoy 2/3 of the game, but despise feeling forced to complete that other third. When Firaxis developed XCOM 2, they added a third mode, an expanded world map. The original series and its reboot had 2 clear modes: the base building and crew equipping phase with a globe that you could use to pass the time, and the turn-based mission phase. Now they added an overworld map that you had to travel across, time-sensitive end-of-game scenarios to rush you, voiced antagonists in the expansion who would hamper your efforts and spam you with dialogue, pickups and additional missions, and it was all a bit much. The British phrase for this is over-egging the pudding, when a creator tries so hard to improve upon something that they manage to spoil it. But that's what modern games need to do. They need to add more of everything until things are stuffed to the gills with so much disposable content that the player is exhausted from it. And no, adding basic RPG elements to your game isn't genre blending. Stop it. Instead, I encourage modern independent developers to take risks and take chances. Sure, you might ruin yourself financially betting on an idea that didn't work out, like many of the pioneers in the DOS gaming era did, but so many of the games as a result of that adventurous spirit continue to be some of the very best the genre has ever made. Maybe you should go back and check them out and see just what you're missing.